Dick Rowland was 19 years old, and he needed to use the bathroom. That was it. That was the entire reason he walked into the Drexel building in downtown Tulsa, Oklahoma, at approximately 11:30 in the morning on May 30th, 1921. The Drexel was a 4-story office building on Main Street. It had one public bathroom. That bathroom was on the top floor, and that bathroom was segregated. White people used the ground floor facilities. Black people had to take the elevator to the top. Dick was a shoe shiner. He worked at a shop on the first floor. He was known in the neighborhood as a good kid, polite, hard-working. He sent money home to his mother. He stayed out of trouble. And on that morning, walking toward the elevator, Dick had no idea that in the next 60 seconds he would set in motion events that would destroy 35 city blocks, kill 300 people, and remain buried in American history books for 100 years. The elevator operator was Sarah Page. She was 17 years old. Some records say 21, but the most reliable sources confirm she was 17. She had been working as an elevator operator for less than 3 months. It was a common job for young white women in 1921, boring, repetitive, spending 8 hours a day pulling a lever to move a metal cage up and down 4 floors, but it paid $3 a week, which was enough to rent a room and buy food. Sarah was not from Tulsa originally. She had moved there from Kansas. She lived in a boarding house on the north side of town. She kept to herself. And on May 30th, standing in her elevator, watching Dick Rowland walk toward her, she had no idea that her name would become synonymous with one of the worst acts of racial violence in American history. What happened next has been debated for 100 years. There were no witnesses inside the elevator, no photographs, no recordings, just 2 teenagers and 30 seconds that changed everything. The most accepted account, based on testimony from both Dick and Sarah, and backed by police investigation, is this. Dick stepped into the elevator. The elevator floor was slightly uneven from the building floor. Dick tripped. Trying to catch himself, he reached out and grabbed the first thing he could. That thing was Sarah's arm. Sarah, startled by someone suddenly grabbing her, screamed. Dick let go immediately and backed out of the elevator. Sarah kept screaming. The elevator doors closed. Dick ran, not because he had done anything criminal, but because he was a black teenager in Oklahoma in 1921, and a white woman had just screamed while he was near her. He ran because staying would mean arrest at best and lynching at worst. He ran because in Oklahoma in 1921, the life of a black man accused of touching a white woman was worth exactly nothing. Dick ran down the stairs and out the front door of the Drexel building. He disappeared into the crowd on Main Street. Behind him, inside the building, a white clerk named Albert Huff had heard Sarah scream. Huff ran to the elevator, saw Sarah shaking, and asked what happened. Sarah, still startled, said a black man had grabbed her arm. Huff looked out the window and saw Dick running. That was all Huff needed to see. He called the police. He told them a black man had attacked a white woman in the elevator. He said the man was running south on Main Street. The police dispatcher put out a call. Patrol officers began searching. Within 20 minutes, they found Dick at his mother's house. They arrested him. They took him to the Tulsa County Jail and locked him in a cell on the top floor. Dick was confused. He kept telling the officers it was an accident. He tripped. He grabbed her arm to keep from falling. That was all. The police believed him. The sheriff believed him. Even the prosecutor believed him. But belief did not matter, because 90 minutes later, at 3 in the afternoon, the Tulsa Tribune newspaper hit the streets. And the headline read, "Nab Negro for attacking girl in elevator." The Tulsa Tribune was an afternoon daily newspaper with a circulation of about 30,000. It was known for sensationalism. It was known for exaggeration. And on May 30th, 1921, it published the most destructive article in its history. The article did not say Dick tripped. It did not say Sarah had refused to press charges. It said Dick Rowland, a black man, had attacked Sarah Page, a white woman, in an elevator. Some witnesses claim the Tribune also published an editorial on the front page with a headline that read, "To Lynch Negro Tonight." That editorial has never been found. The Tribune's archives for May 30th and May 31st, 1921, are missing those specific pages, conveniently missing. But multiple eyewitnesses, both black and white, testified later that they saw the editorial, and whether it existed or not, the damage was done. By 5 p.m., the story was spreading through white Tulsa like fire through dry grass. A black man had attacked a white woman. The police had him in jail. The sheriff was protecting him. White men needed to do something about it. That something was lynching. And by 7:30 in the evening, a crowd had gathered outside the Tulsa County Courthouse. The courthouse was a 3-story stone building on 6th Street and Boulder Avenue. It housed the jail. Dick Rowland was being held on the top floor in a cell that could be reached only by a staircase the sheriff controlled. Sheriff Willard McCullough was 55 years old. He had been sheriff for 9 years. He had seen lynch mobs before, and he had a simple rule. No one got lynched while he was sheriff. Not on his watch, not in his jail. When the crowd began gathering at 7:30, McCullough barricaded the staircase. He stationed 6 deputies with shotguns at the top. He disabled the elevator, and he sent a message to the mayor asking for help. The mayor, T.D. Evans, did nothing. He later claimed he did not believe the situation was serious. By 8 p.m., the crowd had grown to 400 people. By 8:30, it was 1,000. By 9, it was over 2,000. White men, some with guns, some with ropes, all shouting the same thing: "Hand over the Negro, let us have him. We will take care of this." Sheriff McCullough stood at the top of the stairs and shouted back, "No one is getting lynched tonight, go home." The crowd did not go home. They pushed closer to the courthouse doors. Some tried to force their way inside. Deputies fired warning shots into the air. The crowd backed up, but they did not leave. At 9:30 p.m., someone in the crowd shouted that the sheriff had handed Dick Rowland over to a mob and they had lynched him behind the courthouse. It was a lie, a complete fabrication. But the rumor spread instantly. Within minutes, word reached Greenwood, the black neighborhood on the north side of Tulsa. Greenwood was not a slum. It was not a ghetto. It was the wealthiest black community in the United States. People called it Black Wall Street. 35 city blocks, 11,000 residents, over 600 businesses, 2 newspapers, a hospital, a library, schools, churches, hotels, restaurants, movie theaters, law offices, medical practices. Greenwood had more black millionaires per capita than any other city in America. It had been built by black Tulsans who had come to Oklahoma after the Civil War, bought land, started businesses, and created a self-sufficient community that did not need white Tulsa for anything. White Tulsans hated it. They hated that black people could succeed. They hated that Greenwood was prosperous, while many white neighborhoods struggled. And on the night of May 30th, when word reached Greenwood that a black teenager had been lynched downtown, the residents of Greenwood made a decision. They would not let it happen again. Approximately 25 black men, many of them World War I veterans, grabbed rifles and pistols and drove to the courthouse. They arrived at 10:15 p.m. They approached the sheriff. They offered to help guard the jail. They said they would stand with the deputies to make sure no one got lynched. The sheriff thanked them but told them to go home. He said he had the situation under control. The black men did not believe him. They had seen lynch mobs before. They knew how this ended. But they agreed to leave. They got in their cars and started driving back to Greenwood. The white crowd watched them leave. Someone shouted, "Those niggers have guns!" Panic rippled through the crowd. Within seconds, dozens of white men were running to their cars to get their own weapons. At 10:30 p.m., the black men stopped their cars 2 blocks from the courthouse. They saw the white crowd arming themselves. They realized what was about to happen. One of the black veterans, a man named O.B. Mann, later testified that he turned to his friends and said, "We should go back. If we leave now, they are going to kill that boy." The group of black men turned around and drove back to the courthouse. They arrived at 10:45. This time there were more of them, about 75 men. They parked their cars on Boulder Avenue and walked toward the courthouse steps. The white crowd saw them coming. Someone in the white crowd shouted, "What are you niggers doing here?" One of the black veterans, a man whose name was never recorded, shouted back, "We are here to make sure no one gets lynched." A white man in the crowd, later identified as a city police officer, pulled his gun and pointed it at the black veteran. "Nigger, give me that gun." The black veteran refused. The police officer lunged forward and tried to grab the rifle. The 2 men struggled, and then the gun fired. 1 shot. Into the air. No one was hit, but that single gunshot changed everything. In the next 10 seconds, both sides opened fire. 12 people were killed, 10 white, 2 black. The black veterans, realizing they were outnumbered 20-1, ran for their cars. They drove north toward Greenwood. The white mob chased them. Within 30 minutes, 10,000 white Tulsans were mobilizing. They were grabbing guns. They were forming groups. They were heading toward Greenwood. And they were not going there to arrest anyone. They were going there to destroy it. The first fires started at 1 a.m. White mobs, whipped into a frenzy by the myth of a lynched white man and black vets with guns, spilled north out of downtown and into Greenwood. They didn't come as individuals. They came as a force, organized, heavily armed, divided into patrols that moved up block after block. They used gasoline, waiting for the glass to break before throwing their bottles, knowing that fire would do the work faster than bullets ever could. Willie Hall was 11, half awake in a tiny clapboard house on Elgin Avenue. His father, a World War I veteran, burst in and yelled for the family to dress, to prepare to run. Outside, the sky was already orange with flames. You could hear the gunshots, first one at a time, then like popcorn. Willie had never seen his father frightened, but that night he saw it in his eyes. They grabbed what they could carry and ducked out the back door as glass broke in the front. That was the last time Willie saw his childhood home. By 2:15 a.m., the mob was everywhere. Fire leapt block to block: businesses, homes, churches, the Dreamland Theater, Dr. Jackson's medical clinic, the only black hospital in the state. None were spared. Armed white men stood in the streets, shooting at anyone they didn't recognize. Some wore police uniforms, some carried badges. Many did not. National Guardsmen arrived on scene. Instead of stopping the violence, they set up roadblocks, then arrested every black person they found, herding them at gunpoint to internment centers at the ballpark, convention hall, and fairgrounds. They said it was for their safety. It was not. One survivor, Olivia Hooker, remembered ducking beneath a window as two white men set fire to her neighbor's porch. One of them looked through her window, grinned, and walked away. Between 3 and 4 a.m., snipers took up positions. The mob now included off-duty police, local politicians, and men whose names were well known in Tulsa society. They carried hunting rifles and shotguns, sometimes even automatic pistols taken from the National Guard armory. They shot anyone who tried to flee the fires, including women and children. A black father carrying a baby was found in the street. Both shot, both left as a warning. By sunrise, at least 30 blocks were burning. Thousands of black residents, packed into the internment centers or running blind in the woods outside town, could smell the smoke and hear the distant gunfire. Arson teams worked methodically. They used lists. Survivors later swore that some white attackers carried maps of Greenwood, marking addresses of prosperous homes and businesses for special attention. The mob had brought wagons, trucks, even cars, vehicles filled with stolen furniture, jewelry, cash registers, sewing machines, pianos. If it wasn't burned, it was looted. Police officers supervised as mobs broke into homes, dragged out the occupants, and set the place alight. Mrs. Lucille Bishop, a trained nurse, pleaded with a police officer to help her evacuate her patients from the hospital before flames could reach them. He pointed his shotgun at her and said, "You people got yourselves into this." She barely managed to get out before the building collapsed. Lucille ran for her life, covered in soot, with 3 elderly patients in tow. At 5 a.m., the mob turned its eyes upward: the churches, the library, the Masonic Hall, the 2-story brick school building. Molotov cocktails through stained glass, axes and bats for school windows. Thousands watched from the city limits as the symbol of black prosperity in America literally went up in smoke. The roar was deafening. Some survivors later described the firestorm as sounding like a living creature, a monster breathing through the city, eating block after block until there was nothing left but charred skeletons of buildings. But even those who managed to flee were not safe. White men on horseback and in cars patrolled the perimeter of Greenwood, hunting for anyone trying to escape. Some survivors described men shooting at anything that moved. An old man was found alive in a potato cellar. A week later, eyes burned nearly blind from smoke and heat. Other people spent days hiding in the woods, too terrified to return, subsisting on whatever little food and water they had carried with them. By midday, as the fires still blazed and the city stank of burned flesh and chemicals, police and guardsmen finished the roundup. 11,000 black citizens were officially interned, penned up in makeshift camps, forced to wear identity tags and sign out with a white sponsor if they wanted to leave. Families were split, children separated from parents. Many weren't reunited for days, even weeks. In the camps, people lay on the dirt, sleeping under the open sky, nursing burns, wounds, and the trauma of having seen neighbors butchered and homes erased in hours. By the end of May 31st, Greenwood was gone. 35 blocks, 10,000 people displaced. The richest black community in America was now a smoldering wasteland. Official estimates would later claim no more than 36 dead. But bodies were seen carted away on trucks, dumped in the Arkansas River, or buried in secret mass graves on the city's edge. Eyewitnesses, both black and white, claimed the number was closer to 300, maybe more. But in the coming days, those testimonies would be suppressed, ignored, or literally shredded. Hundreds were dead, and the survivors were now prisoners in their own destroyed hometown. Sunset brought no relief. A few small fires still burned, and the mob remained, jeering anyone who looked their way. No rescue, no justice, only fear, grief, and the beginning of a 100-year conspiracy of silence. The sun rose over Tulsa on June 1st, 1921, but it brought no hope. Dawn revealed a city transformed into a war zone. Greenwood, the thriving black neighborhood known across America as Black Wall Street, was burning. Thick black smoke choked the sky. Flames devoured buildings that had stood as monuments to black success and resilience. And above the inferno, circling like vultures, were airplanes. small biplanes, civilian aircraft, flown by white Tulsans, dropping homemade bombs onto the neighborhoods below. This was not war with a foreign enemy. This was American citizens bombing American citizens. It was the first aerial assault on a civilian population in United States history, and it happened not in some distant battlefield, but in Oklahoma, in Tulsa, in 1921. Olivia Hooker was 6 years old that morning. She would remember the sound of the planes for the rest of her life. The low drone of the engines cutting through the roar of the flames, the thump of impact as bundles of dynamite and kerosene-soaked rags hit the rooftops, the explosion, the heat, the way the church roof where her family had taken shelter collapsed inward, sending beams crashing down in showers of sparks and ash. Her mother grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the door. They ran into the street. All around them, Greenwood was dying. Buildings that had stood for decades were reduced to rubble in minutes. Businesses that had thrived for generations vanished in smoke. Families that had built wealth through decades of hard work lost everything in a single night. Dr. Andrew Jackson was 36 years old. He was the best surgeon in Tulsa. Black or white, it did not matter. He had studied at Mayo Clinic. He had performed surgeries that saved countless lives. White doctors across Oklahoma referred their most difficult cases to him because they knew he was the best. But on the morning of June 1st, none of that mattered. Dr. Jackson was black, and he lived in Greenwood. When the mob came for his neighborhood, he tried to surrender peacefully. He walked out of his home with his hands raised. He told the white men he would not resist. He asked them to take him to the police station. They shot him in the street. Multiple times, his body was left where it fell, bleeding into the dirt while his home burned behind him. The destruction was not random. It was organized, methodical, efficient. White mobs moved through Greenwood in coordinated groups. They carried lists, maps. They knew which businesses to hit first, which homes belonged to the wealthiest black families, which buildings would burn fastest. They moved block by block, building by building, setting fires, shooting anyone who tried to stop them, looting everything of value before the flames consumed what remained. Some wore police badges. Some were members of the Tulsa Police Department. Others were National Guardsmen. The very people sworn to protect the citizens of Tulsa were leading the attack. Vincent Harris was a tailor. He was 42 years old. He had opened his shop on Greenwood Avenue in 1910. For 11 years, he had built a reputation as the finest tailor in Tulsa. He made suits for black lawyers, doctors, businessmen. He employed 4 seamstresses. He supported his wife and 3 children on the income from his shop. When the mob reached his building at approximately 2 a.m., they smashed through the front window with a brick. They poured gasoline on the floor. They lit a match. Vincent tried to stop them. He begged them to let him save his equipment, his fabric, his customer records. One of the men hit him in the face with a rifle butt. Vincent fell. The mob moved on to the next building. Vincent's shop burned. Everything he had built over 11 years was gone in 20 minutes. By 5 a.m., the fires had spread across 35 blocks. More than 600 buildings were burning simultaneously. The Tulsa Fire Department responded to calls from white neighborhoods but refused to enter Greenwood. Firefighters later testified that they were ordered not to fight the fires in black neighborhoods. Some said they were threatened by white mobs if they tried. Others said the police told them to stand down. The result was the same. Greenwood burned, and no one came to help. At 9 a.m., the airplanes appeared. Witnesses counted at least 5. Some said as many as 10. They were small civilian aircraft, biplanes, crop dusters, private planes owned by wealthy white Tulsans. Some of the pilots were members of the Ku Klux Klan. Others were simply citizens who hated black success and wanted to destroy it. They flew low over Greenwood, low enough that people on the ground could see their faces. They dropped turpentine bombs, bundles of rags soaked in kerosene and tied around sticks of dynamite. The bombs were crude but effective. They exploded on impact, spreading fire across rooftops and into alleys. Buildings that had survived the initial arson attacks were consumed by the aerial bombardment. The planes made multiple passes. They circled back again and again, dropping their payloads until Greenwood was nothing but smoke and rubble. Mary Elizabeth Jones Parrish was a teacher. She was 34 years old. She lived on North Greenwood Avenue with her 4-year-old daughter. When the mob reached her street at approximately 3:30 a.m., she grabbed her daughter and ran. They made it 2 blocks before white men with rifles stopped them. Mary was forced to stand with her hands raised while the men searched her. They took her purse. They took her daughter's coat. They laughed while they did it. Then they marched Mary and dozens of other black residents toward the convention center. The march took 40 minutes. White crowds lined the streets, jeering and spitting. Some threw stones. Police officers watched and did nothing. At the convention center, Mary and approximately 4,000 other Black Tulsans were held in what could only be described as an internment camp. They were not allowed to leave. They were not given food or water for the first 12 hours. They were not told when they would be released. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter. Anyone who tried to leave was threatened with arrest or shot. The killing was widespread. Bodies littered the streets. Some were shot. Some were beaten to death. Some were burned alive in buildings they could not escape. Witnesses later testified to seeing trucks loaded with bodies driving out of Greenwood in the early morning hours. The trucks headed north, toward the river and the outskirts of town. No one knows how many bodies were dumped in the Arkansas River. No one knows how many were buried in unmarked mass graves on the edge of the city. The official death toll, released by the city of Tulsa days later, was 36. 36 people killed in the worst race massacre in American history. It was a lie. The American Red Cross estimated at least 300 dead. Some witnesses said 500, others said more. The truth was buried along with the bodies, and for decades no one was allowed to speak it. By noon, on June 1st, Greenwood was gone. 35 blocks of homes, businesses, churches, schools, hospitals, theaters, and libraries were reduced to ash. More than 1,200 buildings destroyed. 10,000 people displaced. 6,000 arrested and interned. Hundreds dead. And not a single white person was ever charged with a crime. Not one arrest, not one trial, not one conviction. The city of Tulsa blamed the Black residents of Greenwood for defending themselves. They called it a riot. They said Black people had started the violence. They said the destruction was justified. And for the next 80 years, that was the official story. Insurance companies refused to pay claims. Black property owners who tried to rebuild were denied building permits. City officials rezoned Greenwood as industrial land, making it illegal to rebuild homes. Families who had owned their property for decades were told they no longer had legal title. The theft was systematic, complete, by design. White Tulsa did not just destroy Black Wall Street. They erased it. They stole the land. They rewrote the history. They buried the truth. And they got away with it. For decades, survivors were told not to speak about what happened. Teachers were forbidden from teaching it in schools. Newspapers refused to print stories about it. The city removed all references to the massacre from public records. Young people growing up in Tulsa in the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s had no idea it had ever happened. The most violent race massacre in American history was hidden in plain sight, forgotten, until it was not, until survivors started speaking, until historians started digging, until the mass graves were discovered, and the truth finally began to emerge. The violence stopped on June 1st, 1921, at approximately 12 noon. The Oklahoma National Guard arrived. Martial law was declared. White mobs were ordered to disperse. The fires were allowed to burn out. And by sunset, Greenwood was gone. But the nightmare was far from over. For the 6,000 Black Tulsans who had been rounded up at gunpoint and forced into internment camps, the horror was just beginning. The camps were not shelters. They were prisons. The largest was the Convention Hall on Brady Street in downtown Tulsa. It was a massive exhibition building normally used for trade shows and civic events. On June 1st, 1921, it became a concentration camp. Armed guards surrounded the building. Machine guns were positioned at the entrances. 6,000 Black men, women, and children were packed inside. They were not told why they were being held. They were not told when they would be released. They were given no food for the first 12 hours, no water, no medical care. Children cried. The elderly collapsed. The wounded bled onto the concrete floor. And outside, white Tulsans gathered to stare at the prisoners through the windows. Some laughed, some jeered, some took photographs. Damie Rowland was 28 years old. She was a school teacher. She had been dragged from her home at gunpoint at 7 a.m. on June 1st while trying to save her students who had taken refuge in her classroom. She was marched through the streets of Greenwood with her hands raised. White men lined the sidewalks, shouting at her, calling her names, spitting. One threw a rock that hit her in the shoulder. A police officer saw it happen. He did nothing. At the convention hall, Damie was separated from her students. She never saw 3 of them again. Their names were never added to any official casualty list. They simply disappeared. Damie spent 8 days in the convention hall. She slept on the floor. She was given 1 meal a day, bread and water. When she asked when she would be released, the guards told her to shut up. When she asked if she could send word to her family in Kansas City that she was alive, they laughed. The conditions in the camps were designed to break people, to humiliate them, to make them understand that they were not citizens with rights but prisoners at the mercy of white authority. Black Tulsans were not released unless a white citizen vouched for them. The system worked like this. A white employer would come to the camp and request a specific black worker. That worker would be released into the custody of the white employer. The employer would sign a document taking legal responsibility for that person's behavior. In exchange, the black worker was required to return to their job immediately. No time to search for family members, no time to look for missing children, no time to bury the dead. You went back to work, or you stayed in the camp. Those were the only options. Robert Fairchild was 19 years old. He worked as a porter at the Hotel Tulsa. His white supervisor came to the convention hall on June 3rd and asked for him by name. Robert was brought to the front of the camp. His supervisor looked him over like he was inspecting livestock. Then he signed the release papers. Robert was handed a green card that read, "Police Protection." He was told to carry it at all times. If he was found without it, he would be arrested and returned to the camp. Robert asked his supervisor if he could have a few hours to find his mother and sister. His supervisor said no. Robert was taken directly back to the hotel and put to work. He did not see his mother again for 6 weeks. He never found his sister. Her name was Lena Fairchild. She was 16 years old. She is believed to have died in the massacre. Her body was never recovered. The camps operated for 10 days. During that time, no outside observers were allowed in. No journalists, no Red Cross officials, no lawyers. The city of Tulsa controlled who entered and who left. Information about conditions inside the camps was suppressed. Survivors later testified that people died in the camps from untreated wounds, from dehydration, from despair. But no records were kept, no death certificates were issued, no bodies were claimed. The official position of the city was that the camps were necessary to protect black residents from further violence. The reality was different. The camps were a way to control the black population, to break their spirit, to make sure they understood that Greenwood would not be rebuilt on their terms. On June 14, the last prisoners were released. By then, most had been forced to sign loyalty oaths promising not to speak publicly about what had happened. Some were threatened with rearrest if they talked to journalists. Others were told their property would be confiscated if they caused trouble. The message was clear. Be silent. Be grateful you are alive, and do not ask for justice, because you will not get it. The physical destruction of Greenwood was total, but the economic destruction was even worse. Insurance companies refused to pay claims. Black property owners filed over 1-800 claims for damages. Not a single claim was paid in full. Most were denied outright. Insurance companies argued that the destruction was caused by a riot, and riot damage was not covered under standard policies. The fact that the riot had been started by white mobs and aided by city officials did not matter. Black residents lost everything, and they received nothing in return. B.C. Franklin was a lawyer. He had moved to Tulsa in 1920 to open a law practice. His office on Greenwood Avenue was destroyed in the fires. Everything he owned was burned. But Franklin did not leave Tulsa. He stayed, and he fought. He set up a makeshift law office in a tent on the edge of the ruins. For months, he worked without pay, filing lawsuits on behalf of black property owners. He sued the city. He sued the insurance companies. He sued individual white rioters. He lost every case. The courts ruled against him again and again. Judges dismissed lawsuits without hearings. Juries refused to award damages. The legal system, like every other institution in Tulsa, was designed to protect white interests and punish black resistance. The city passed an ordinance requiring all reconstruction in Greenwood to meet new fire safety codes. The codes were deliberately written to make rebuilding prohibitively expensive. Brick construction was required. Wooden structures were banned. The cost of compliance was far beyond what most black families could afford. The ordinance was later ruled unconstitutional, but by then many families had already given up and left Tulsa. Those who stayed rebuilt slowly, painfully, with money borrowed at predatory interest rates from white banks that charged double the normal rates. Greenwood was rebuilt, but it was never the same. The death toll remains unknown. The official count was 36. The Red Cross estimated 300. Some witnesses said 500, others said more. In the weeks following the massacre, mass graves were reported at 3 locations: Oaklawn Cemetery, New Block Park, the Arkansas River. Survivors testified to seeing dump trucks filled with bodies heading toward these locations in the early morning hours of June 1st and June 2nd. But no investigation was conducted. No bodies were exhumed. No records were kept. The dead were buried and forgotten. For 50 years, the Tulsa Race Massacre was not taught in Oklahoma schools. Textbooks did not mention it. Teachers were discouraged from discussing it. Children who grew up in Tulsa in the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s had no idea it had ever happened. Even black children whose grandparents had survived the massacre often did not know the full story. Families did not talk about it. The trauma was too deep, the fear too real. Survivors were afraid that speaking publicly would bring retaliation, so they stayed silent. And the silence became a second crime, a conspiracy of forgetting that lasted 3 generations. It was not until 1996 that the Oklahoma legislature created a commission to investigate the massacre. The commission spent 5 years collecting testimony from survivors, reviewing historical documents, and uncovering evidence that had been hidden for decades. In 2001, the commission released its report. The report confirmed what survivors had been saying for 80 years. The massacre was not a riot, it was a coordinated attack. White mobs, aided by city officials and law enforcement, had systematically destroyed Greenwood. Hundreds had been killed, thousands had been displaced, and the city of Tulsa had covered it up. The report made recommendations: reparations for survivors, a memorial, an official apology, a scholarship fund for descendants. None of it happened. The Oklahoma legislature refused to act. No reparations were paid. No apology was issued. The survivors, most of them in their 90s by then, died waiting for justice that never came. In 2020, researchers began searching for the mass graves. Using ground-penetrating radar, they identified anomalies at Oaklawn Cemetery consistent with mass burials. In October 2020, excavation began. On July 14, 2021, researchers announced they had found a mass grave containing at least 30 bodies. The remains showed evidence of gunshot wounds. The bodies had been buried quickly, without coffins, in a trench. It was the first physical evidence confirming what survivors had testified to for 100 years. There were mass graves, there were hundreds of dead, and the city of Tulsa had lied about it for a century. As of 2021, only 3 survivors of the Tulsa Race Massacre were still alive: Viola Fletcher, Hughes Van Ellis, Leslie Benningfield Randall. Fletcher was 107 years old. Van Ellis was 100. Randall was 106. All 3 testified before Congress in May 2021, asking for justice, asking for reparations, asking for recognition. Congress listened. Congress thanked them. Congress did nothing. The 3 survivors are still waiting, still hoping, still believing that America will finally acknowledge what was done to them and their community 100 years ago. But time is running out, and history has taught them not to hope too hard. Here is a detailed and immersive 5th chapter, around 1,800 words, on the aftermath, legacy, and long-term impact of the Tulsa Race Massacre, written for maximum emotional and narrative impact, including what is known from historical research, survivors' experiences, the struggle for memory, and the century-long fight for justice. June 1921. Greenwood was gone, and what followed was a second, slower massacre, a massacre against memory, truth, and hope. In the days after the smoke cleared, the city of Tulsa began its campaign to erase what had happened, to bury not only the dead, but also the evidence, the eyewitness accounts, and the possibility that America might be forced to confront what one city had done to its own. On the devastated streets, the stench of charred wood and bodies lingered. Survivors, homeless, traumatized, and in shock, wandered through the ruins, searching for lost relatives and neighbors. Most would never find them. Those who did were often greeted by silence. Grief was so great it became physically overwhelming, fracturing families as surely as bullets or firebombs had done the week before. Internment camps, which had held over 6,000 Black Tulsans, continued to operate into mid-June. The system of release by white sponsor kept families separated and forced many back into menial labor before they could even look for missing children, parents, or siblings. The American Red Cross, led by Maurice Willows, stepped in where local government refused, providing food, shelter, and medical care. Red Cross tents lined the horizon for a year. Most survivors lived through at least one winter under canvas, the Oklahoma winds driving needles of cold into their battered bodies and souls. The city's response was clear. No one was to speak of what had happened. Newspapers destroyed their archives, articles vanished, and city officials refused to include Black voices in the official record. Racial violence was rebranded as a riot, placing blame on the victims, Black Tulsans, who dared defend their homes, and absolve the white mob and the system that armed, encouraged, and enabled them. No white person stood trial for murder, arson, or theft. No insurance paid claims. Some policies explicitly excluded riot damages. Others simply cited act of God. Mass graves rumored in Oaklawn Cemetery, New Block Park, and along the river remained undisturbed. Survivors tried to raise memorials for loved ones lost, but city officials tore down the markers, ordered gravesites bulldozed, and threatened anyone who asked too many questions. Still, the survivors, people like Olivia Hooker, Damie Rowland, and attorney B.C. Franklin, fought to rebuild. Franklin and a handful of others set up tent law offices, offering free help to file claims and lawsuits. They lost almost all their cases, but the act of fighting itself became a gesture of defiance, a statement that Greenwood would not accept annihilation without protest. The first fragile attempt to rebuild Greenwood began late in 1921. Despite city ordinances calculated to prevent it, a core of residents returned to the ruins and started over, laying new foundations atop the scorched earth. The hardship was immeasurable. Many former property owners became renters, often leasing their rebuilt homes from white speculators who had acquired the ruins cheaply. Homes and businesses rose, but not as before. Black land ownership never regained pre-massacre levels. Whole family trees vanished, others spread far afield, never to return. By the 1930s, much of Greenwood's business district was restored, though its golden years would never return. In the 1960s and 1970s, urban renewal and the construction of highways cut through the heart of what had rebounded, once again decimating Black wealth and scattering descendants. And for generations, the massacre was not taught in schools. Children, Black and white, grew up ignorant of what had happened on those city streets. The culture of silence and denial reigned, and for most of the 20th century, even survivors were afraid to speak. Many went to their graves without telling their own children the story of June 1921, terrified by the threats made in the massacre's wake. It was not until the 1990s that survivors began, at last, to speak publicly. Old men and women, haunted a lifetime by the flames and gunfire, recounted what they had seen. Their stories shocked America: bodies dumped in rivers, machine-gunned houses, children hiding under beds, flames bleaching the night sky day bright. In 1996, the Oklahoma legislature established the Tulsa Race Riot Commission, later renamed the Race Massacre Commission. Over 5 years, the commission revealed what the city had spent decades suppressing: that law enforcement handed out rifles to white mobs, city officials deputized arsonists, and Tulsa's economic heart was systematically wiped out. The report recommended direct reparations for survivors, scholarships for descendants, and a permanent memorial. But in the years after its publication in 2001, little was done. Survivors, now health-depleted elderly, some living in poverty just a mile from where their families once thrived, watched another kind of silence settle in, that of official inaction. The pain of 100 years found new voice in the survivors who clung on into their 90s. People like Viola Fletcher, Leslie Benningfield Randall, and Hughes Van Ellis. Fletcher, 107 in 2021, testified before Congress. Her hands shook not with age, but with the memory of buildings burning and bodies in the road. She told Congress, "I will never forget the violence of the white mob. We were left with nothing." Her brother, Hughes Van Ellis, echoed her, "Our country may forget this history, but I cannot. I have lived through the massacre every day. Our country may forget, but we will not." Even as they spoke, their city heaved with the ghosts of its past. Ground-penetrating radar revealed mass graves at Oaklawn Cemetery, finally confirming survivors' long-silenced accounts. DNA testing of bones, begun in 2021, is ongoing, but hundreds of families still lack closure. For journalists and documentary makers, Greenwood became a symbol. The photographs of families in Red Cross tents, of raised streets, of dignified men in Sunday best sitting atop their own homes' ashes, haunt American memory. Black Wall Street became a byword for not just what was lost, but what was possible. A thriving, self-sustaining Black metropolis, and the destruction that white fear unleashed upon it. In May 2021, President Joe Biden became the first sitting U.S. president to visit Greenwood and publicly commemorate the massacre. He met with survivors and descendants, promising a reckoning. But justice remains elusive. Lawsuits for reparations wind through the courts. Resistance is fierce. Some descendants have won scholarships or momentary media attention, but most live with the long shadow of loss, of generational trauma, of vanished property, of families fractured forever. Greenwood's legacy has also inspired. Across America, young Black entrepreneurs and activists trace their roots, literal or aspirational, to Black Wall Street, drawing lessons in community, resistance, and survival. The new Greenwood Rising Museum, opened in 2021, attempts to tell the truth, to challenge denial, and give faces and names to those lost, those who rebuilt, and those still fighting. But the fifth and final tragedy, after the bombings, the murders, the internment, and the cover-up, is that America was never forced to face what Greenwood means. Official school curricula in Oklahoma remained silent until the 2020s. Even now, some push back against teaching the truth, fearing shame or anger. Yet Greenwood endures, first as a physical place, then as a story, now as a call to action. The massacre destroyed more than buildings. It sought to obliterate hope, memory, and the Black American dream. And still, in the crackle of the Red Cross cooking fire, in the lawyer's battered tent, in the voices of survivors testifying before Congress, hope reignites, fragile but unbroken. As the story closes, the fight for true justice, a full accounting, reparation, and unflinching memory remains unfinished. The ghosts of Greenwood still walk, in the hands of descendants rebuilding shattered wealth, in the prayers at mass graves, in the nation's long overdue confrontation with its own capacity for denial and destruction. The massacre was not just Tulsa's tragedy. It was and is America's unfinished reckoning, a question after a century with only one true answer: remember and never again.